If You Know Her, a novel of romantic suspense. By Shiloh Walker. Narrated by Cris Dukehart. Copyright 2012 by Shiloh Walker. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Shiloh Walker, care of Irene Goodman Literary Agency, and was produced in the year 2012 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Chapter 1. Jolene had been dead for 6 months. 6 long months. Nia Hollister lay on her bed, staring up at the ceiling as she tried to will herself to sleep. But sleep wasn't coming. It wasn't getting any easier. Nothing was easier. Sleeping, living, moving on with her life. But how was she supposed to get on with her life when her cousin, her best friend, her only family was gone? Murdered, dead and buried. Brutalized by some monster for reasons that Nia couldn't even fathom. Even after 6 long months, she still felt like she had a hole in her chest the size of the entire state of Virginia. The fact that the man who'd killed Jolie was dead made no difference. Not to her. It changed nothing. It helped nothing. Eased none of her pain. Not even watching as they'd lowered his worthless corpse into the ground had helped. That should have helped, right? He was dead. The man who had killed her cousin was dead. That should give her closure, right? Closure. Shit. Did people really think having closure helped? It sure as hell wasn't helping her. Knowing who did it, how did that help? Exhausted, sick at heart, and still as miserable now as she had been the day she'd found out the truth, Nia sat up in her bed and rummaged around on her bedside table until she found a mangled pack of cigarettes. She'd stopped smoking 3 years ago. She'd started again 5.5 months ago. She kept telling herself she'd stop, and she knew she needed to, but she just couldn't work up the energy to care. Right now, she couldn't quite give a fuck if she was polluting her lungs. Right now, she was having a hard time finding anything that mattered. Sighing, she lit a cigarette and climbed out of bed, moved to stare out the window. It was dark and quiet. She was far enough outside the city that the lights from town were muted, and she could see the stars. There had been a time when she had loved nights like this. Now she hated them, hated the quiet, hated the peace. It seemed like that was when she heard it the loudest. Heard her. It was just her imagination, but it seemed so real. Jolie screaming. God, how she must have screamed. Had she begged? Had she pleaded? Shit. Heedless of the smoking cigarette in her hands, she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, as though that might help her from hearing the screams, might keep her from thinking about her cousin, her best friend. The woman who'd been murdered by some sick-ass bastard who was now rotting away under 6 feet of dirt. She should take comfort in that, Nia reckoned. But she couldn't. Didn't. It just felt too unfinished. Blowing out a breath, she lowered her hands and eyed the cigarette. Gonna catch my damn hair on fire, she muttered. Putting it between her lips, she inhaled. As the smoke filled her lungs, she tipped her head back and stared up at the darkened ceiling. Yeah, it felt damn unfinished. But Joe Carson had been found with Jolie's watch on him and her clothing, and other evidence had been found at the cabin where he'd been squatting. What were they supposed to do? In some sick, convoluted way, it even made sense, once somebody had explained things to her. Hope Carson had left her abusive ex-husband and spent 2 years on the move because she feared he might come after her. Finally, she decided she was going to settle in with their friend Law Reilly. The ex must have been watching her pretty damn close, timing-wise. No, Nia didn't quite buy the timing bit, because her cousin had been grabbed before Hope had arrived in Ash, Kentucky, but the cops had shrugged it off. There wasn't any secret that she was friends with Reilly. Reilly had confirmed she'd been making plans to come stay with him. They'd speculated that Carson had just made a lucky guess, or suggested maybe he'd had some inside knowledge. Their suggestions hadn't meant shit to her. So, Hope arrives in Ash and her ex-husband waits until she sort of settles in, and then he kills Nia's cousin, leaves her body right where Hope can all but trip over it, trying to scare Hope into running. Just trying to scare her? Warn her? This will be you if you don't toe the line? It's all so fucked up. she whispered. Damn it, Jolie, what am I supposed to do? Why can't I let go? But there wasn't any answer. Leaning her brow against the chilled glass, Nia smoked her cigarette and suffered the miserable silence, alone. Her name had been Mara Burns. She'd been his first. A man didn't forget his first. His first fuck, his first love, his first wife. His first kill. He'd had different first. Mara had been his first kill, and she'd been sweet. It hadn't been planned. At all. It had been back in college, and she had been a hot, sweet little bitch. But the first few times he'd tried to ask her out, she hadn't given him the time of day. That changed his senior year, and she'd been the one to ask him out, as a ploy to make a boyfriend jealous mostly, and he had known. They'd gone out, fucked in his car, then she whispered for him to hit her, to choke her. He hadn't, but he'd imagined it. When he took her home, she'd mocked him, but he'd been so caught up in those images, he had barely noticed. That night, he'd dreamed about it, choking her, hitting her. Thoughts of it consumed him. Weeks passed, turned into months. They rarely spoke, but he saw her, and each time it made those fantasies burn hotter, brighter. One night she'd been walking home from her job. He'd seen her because he'd been watching. Watching, dreaming. He had offered her a ride. Because it was starting to rain, or maybe because she wanted to taunt him some more, she'd accepted. But then he hadn't taken her home, and she had put her bitch face on. He'd backhanded her. Instead of getting pissed or scared, she'd been turned on. They went back to the quiet, secluded little area outside of Lexington where they'd fucked that first night, and they went at each other like animals. They started out in the back of the car, moved to the trunk, and eventually ended up on the ground. He'd hit her, and she would come. He'd squeeze her neck until she almost blacked out, and she'd come harder. For hours. But then, toward the end of the night, as he was driving into her, chasing another climax, his fingers digging into her silken neck, he'd squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. He'd let go, watched as she sucked in a ragged breath of air right as he climaxed so hard it had almost hurt, and he'd thought about how he hadn't wanted to let go. Then, when she was smiling at him, he'd closed his hands around her neck. For reasons he couldn't understand then, he'd started choking her again, and that time he hadn't stopped. Not when her heels beat on the ground, not when she had torn at his hands with her nails, real fear beginning to flicker in her eyes, not even when her bowels and bladder had released. His mind had remained cool, detached throughout all of it, even as his heart had raced at the thrill. His first kill. Yes, Mara had been one of the most beautiful firsts of his life. A man didn't forget his first. He'd worried for years somebody would discover her, discover what happened to Mara, and somehow link her back to him. But in the end, she wasn't the one who was coming to haunt him. Hers wasn't the face he dreamed of at night now. And she wasn't the reason he had been forced to put a stop to his games for a while. Because he couldn't indulge in those games, he was all but burning, all but dying to feel that thrill again. The pleasure he found only when he took a life. She wasn't the reason he felt like a ticking time bomb, one that burned hotter, brighter, every damn day. No, that honor belonged to one Jolene Hollister and one Lena Riddle. Jolene had almost gotten away from him, had screamed bloody murder, and Lena had heard her screaming, had called the cops, had stirred up too much attention. 6 months. It had been 6 months. He knew how to wait. Sometimes he felt like a lump of coal under extreme pressure, like he'd emerge a diamond, after a bit of polishing and cutting down. Other times, he just felt like he was going to explode, and right now was one of those times. 6 fucking months. It was worse being in here, in this crush of people. A wedding was a big deal in a small town like Ash, though, and Lena and Ezra hadn't spared any expense. The inn was full to bursting. The reception had been going strong for more than an hour, and he had no doubt it would keep going for another hour at least. He couldn't even make a quiet escape, though. It would be too easily noticed. So he waited, chatted, and danced. He danced with the bride. He danced with the bridesmaids. He danced with the flower girl, he danced with the married women whose husbands wouldn't dance, he danced with the tittering, blushing girls who were still learning how to flirt. He danced with so many women. So many. Tall, short, lean, lush. Short hair that barely brushed their jawline, long hair that fell to their hips, hair upswept to leave their shoulders bare. Jewelry sparkled and glowed against toned and tanned flesh. Over by the bar, he spotted Rosalind Jennings talking with the bride, her curves poured into a dark green dress that clung so lovingly. Gold glinted at her neck, ears, and wrists. On the dance floor, he saw Hope Carson, dancing with her beau, Remy Jennings, wearing a dress just like Rosalind's, the same deep, deep green. But where Rosalind looked like a witch, Hope looked like some fey woodland nymph, sweet and innocent and lovely. She wore little jewelry, but there were flowers in her short, shiny hair. Then there was the bride, her deep red locks glowing against the white of her dress, pearls at her neck, gold on her fingers. All the women. Hunger pulsed inside him, driving him mad, making him greedy and desperate. Desperate, but not too desperate. Not so desperate he'd get foolish again. Not here. Not now. At present, he had a girl, just barely out of college, wrapped around him, and it pissed him off. Perhaps it turned him on a little as she pressed her breast against his arm, smiling up at him and trying to act like she was so much older than she really was. But she was just a child. Besides, he also had a lady nearby who would notice before much longer, and although she would understand, he didn't want her upset. Especially not by an obnoxious little bitch like this. As she swayed a little too close, he dipped his head and murmured, "Estella." "Star. I'm going by Star now. Estella is so old," she said, giving her lower lip what she probably thought was a seductive stroke of tongue. "Estella Price," he repeated. "I don't know why you keep rubbing against me like that. I've known you since you were in diapers. I'm pretty sure I probably even changed one or two." He hadn't, but it had the desired effect. She turned almost as red as the lipstick she'd slicked on her mouth and jerked away from him. Suppressing a chuckle, he lost himself in the crowd and headed toward the cash bar. He needed a drink, and he wanted to see if he couldn't work his way out of here yet. If he didn't escape soon. This wasn't where he wanted to be, wasn't where he needed to be, except the whole damn town was here. There were places a guy wanted to be in life. In bed with a long, lean woman wrapped around him? That topped the list as far as Law Reilly was concerned. Although he wouldn't mind a cabin in the mountains, just him and his laptop. He'd be fine with swapping out the laptop for a long, lean woman. Or even a shack on a beach, just him and his laptop. Again, the swap out. His laptop for a long, lean woman. That would work. And some beer on hand. The place he didn't want to be, though. A wedding in small-town Kentucky. Namely, Ash, Kentucky, where he'd been living for the past 10 years. Long enough that he could call the place home. Long enough that most of the people knew him by face, by name, and by bank account. Even if most of them didn't entirely know where the money came from. They just knew he wasn't hurting for cash, and at a wedding with a lot of single women, that was always dangerous. Even if he'd been in his 60s, balding and carrying a spare tire, it would be dangerous. But Law was 34, still had a full head of hair, and while he might not see himself as the cover model for any magazine, he didn't have a spare tire either. Yeah, this was a dangerous place to be, and he was in a lousy mood anyway. His mood got darker and uglier each time one of the single women would come up and flirt, attempt to make some sly remark about his single status. He could handle this, get through the reception. He just had to have a game plan and be cautious. Things had been going fairly well, too, for about the first hour. At a wedding, a guy didn't want to make eye contact, didn't want to stand around looking like he might be anything resembling lonely. None of that stuff, because sometimes the single women got ideas in their head. If he wanted to make it out of there sane and without making himself look like an ass at his best friend's wedding, he had to exercise caution. Sometimes caution could serve a man well. And sometimes so could throwing caution to the wind. Law Reilly was tempted to throw caution to the wind and just get the hell out of the inn, especially after Mackenzie Cartwright came simpering up to him, pressing her breasts up against him, angling herself so he could see clear down to her belly button if he wanted. He looked. Hell, why not? She put herself there on display. But she also was in the mood to dance and maybe leave early. Weddings always made her... She'd actually trailed off with a suggestive giggle as she slid her hand down, resting it on his hip. Shit. Part of the wedding party, kid, he said, tacking the kid on just to annoy her. She was 23, definitely too young for him, although hardly a kid. I think I'm supposed to hang around a while. Then he had put some serious floor space between them and wondered how long he needed to hang around. He didn't want to be there. Didn't want to watch as Lena Riddle snuggled up against Ezra King for what had to be their 50th damn kiss. But she wasn't Lena Riddle now. She was Lena King. And he wasn't jealous, exactly. Well, he was. He was damn jealous, but not because he wanted to be the one she was pressing her pretty mouth against. There had been a time when that was exactly what he wanted. But he wasn't the one for Lena. Lena was happy with the guy, happier than Law had ever seen her. He couldn't begrudge her that happiness, even if once upon a time he'd imagined himself in Ezra's place. There was an ache in his heart, though, yearning wisps of envy that had him wishing he was anywhere but here. Okay, anywhere but here or anywhere with Mackenzie. Home, alone, sounded good. Weddings weren't exactly his favorite way to pass the time, but this was one of his best friends, and even though once upon a time he desperately loved her, seeing her happy was important to him. With just about anybody else, he could have ignored the invite. Except he was the one who had given away the bride. Hard to ignore the invite when that was the case. Sighing, he tipped his beer back and counted down the minutes until he could make a polite escape. For Lena, he could be polite. "You look about as happy to be here as you'd be at your own funeral," a soft, quiet voice said. Glancing down, he made himself smile. Hope Carson stood barely 5'6", even in the 3-inch heels she'd worn with her maid of honor dress. She was slender, and she was the only other person in the entire world with the power to get him into a monkey suit. Her dress was as green as her eyes and gleamed against her pale skin. She'd always had that delicate beauty, but tonight, he had to admit, she looked amazing. And every guy that looked at her longer than 2 seconds probably felt the lingering stare of her boyfriend, the county DA, Remy Jennings. Well, every guy but Law. Law was nothing more than a brother to Hope, like she was nothing more than a sister to him, a fact that Remy was more than well aware of. So when Hope leaned against him and hugged him, Law wasn't overly concerned when Remy's eyes lingered on them. Hell, he enjoyed needling the guy anyway. That was what had him leaning down and pressing his mouth to Hope's. Pissing the DA off was a favorite pastime of his, had been for a while. Passing a hand over Hope's hair, careful not to dislodge the delicate spray of flowers near her right ear, he said, "You look amazing, sweetheart." "Thanks." She smoothed a hand down one narrow hip and sent a look over her shoulder, smiling in Lena's direction. "It looks like her day went well, right?" "Well, she's married. That was the goal, right?" Hope rolled her eyes. "You're such a guy. Yes, she's married, and that's the goal, sort of. But getting there, how they do it, the memories, it matters." "Whatever." Law took another drink of his beer, shooting Remy another look. He was talking to one of his cousins, Carter Jennings, Roz's husband. Hank Jennings was also there, with some woman Law couldn't immediately place. Hank was the mayor, and in Law's opinion, a Class A asshole, although he'd gotten a little better over the past few months. The Jennings clan. The whole damn county was lousy with them. 3 cousins served on the town council. The vice principal of the high school was also a Jennings. Several of the county cops were Jennings by blood, a few were Jennings through marriage, and at least one person on the minuscule city police department. 1/4 of the people in Ash were related to the Jennings clan in some way, shape, or form. Hope would be one of them before another year was out. Law had no doubt about it. "Speaking of goals, you think you might make a run for that goal with Remy anytime soon?" Hope blushed and hunched her shoulders. I don't know." "You haven't talked about it?" Her blush deepened. Law laughed. That's a yes. And knowing her as well as he did, he suspected she was terrified and excited. Dipping his head, he kissed her again, this time pressing his lips to her brow. Go for it, kid. You know you're not going to find another guy who will love you the way he does, and you're never going to love anybody as much as you love him. She sighed. No, you're right. Something dark and ugly moved through her eyes. Memories that would take a lot longer than a few months to fade. He's gone, kid. Dead and gone. I know, it's just... She didn't have to say. Law knew her as well as she knew herself sometimes. Hope and Law had gone to high school together back in Clinton, Oklahoma, a small town that was pretty much dominated by one family, kind of like the Jennings seemed to dominate Ash, Kentucky, at least in size. But the Carson family wasn't a kind dictator. Hope had married the golden boy, Joseph Carson, not too long after they'd graduated. His control over her had been subtle at first. Dress how I want you to dress. Act how I want you to act. Wear your hair the way I want. And when she didn't, that's when the real abuse started. Years passed, and it got to the point to where Hope felt the only escape was through killing herself. She'd tried, and failed. Her ex-husband had been a cop, and he'd abused his badge and his family's name, managed to get her locked away in a mental institution. When she got out, the abuse had gotten so much worse. It wasn't until Law finally managed to get back in touch with her, after a few years of sketchy communication, that he realized just how bad things had been. He no longer gave a damn about any so-called power the Carson family might have had, and at that point, he'd been more than capable of causing his own brand of trouble. He'd gone looking for Hope, and he would never forgive himself for not doing it sooner. Once he realized how bad things were, Law had been ready to kill Joe. Although Hope had never confirmed it, he suspected that was what had given her the courage to leave. Not fear for herself, but fear for what it would do to Law's life. Why in the hell hadn't he gone back sooner? Why hadn't he known? She'd gone through hell, and if he'd listened to his gut, he could have done something. Anything. Like kill the bastard. He could have killed the bastard and saved Hope all that heartache. Damn the consequences. A storm of memories burned in the back of his mind. Memories he struggled to hold at bay. Fuck that bastard to hell and back. Law? A soft, cool hand touched his cheek, and he looked down, met Hope's sad eyes. It's not on us, right? He just stared at her. You keep telling me I can't blame myself for what he did. I can't blame myself for Nielsen being dead, and I can't blame myself for how he killed that girl. Nielsen, the cop who died, saving Hope when Carson came after her. And Jolie. That girl, the memory of the woman who'd lost her life was imprinted on his mind forever. A wound he'd carry for always. That girl. Swallowing, he looked away. His voice was gruff as he said, her name was Jolene. Jolie Hollister. Jolie. Hope looked away. I know her name. But you keep telling me I'm not to blame. How can I believe that, though, when I look at you and see how much you blame yourself? Swearing, he shoved a hand through his dark, overlong golden-brown hair, only to have it fall right back into his face. Closing his eyes, he shook his head. It's not the same, Hope, damn it. I knew something was wrong. I didn't listen to my gut. I didn't do anything. Neither did I, she said flatly. All the times he left bruises on me, I didn't just know. I had proof, physical proof. I could have left, I could have come to you, even a phone call would have been enough. But I stayed. I can try to move past my guilt, but it's going to be damn hard to do it if I see my best friend wallowing in his. He narrowed his eyes at her. That's pretty damn manipulative. Yeah, it is. She cocked a brow at him. But if it works. Then she shrugged and pushed up onto her toes, pressed a kiss to his cheek. Stop brooding. Go talk to people. Ethan's here, that deputy from the sheriff's office. You two hang out some. Go talk to him, have fun. You look like you're facing an IRS audit or something. Law grimaced. Shit, he'd rather face that. He had an accountant he paid to handle that shit. But he couldn't pay somebody to handle this for him. Chapter 2. 3 months later. She was sleeping when he climbed out of bed. By the time he came out of the shower, she was stirring, and he knelt by the bed, pressed his lips to hers. She turned her head aside so his lips brushed her cheek. "Morning breath," she muttered. He laughed. "You going to call me when you get to the hotel?" Yes. Although he already knew the answer, being ever dutiful, he knew he had to ask. "You sure you don't want to come with me?" In the dim light, filtering from the hallway, he could see her grimace. "No, not my thing. You know that. But you go, have fun." He kissed her again. "I'll try. I'll miss you." You do that. Bring me back something pretty." "You know I will." In his mind, he was already making plans. He was heading to Chicago. It was a big city, one he was familiar with, and although he'd miss the pleasure of a leisurely hunt, he couldn't keep putting this off. The urge was a hungry, boiling need inside him. By the time he was ready to head out the door, she was already lost once more to sleep. He paused to look in on her one more time, smiling absently at her. Then he left, impatience building, burning inside him. He needed to be gone, away from here and gone. He hadn't realized it would be this hard to stop. Her name was Katya, or at least that was the name she'd given him. He didn't know if that was her true name, and just then he didn't care. All he cared about was getting her out of this club, getting her to a quiet, private place. She didn't know her time was running down. He figured that the one thing she was aware of was the need for sex. He could see it in her eyes. It probably had something to do with the pills she'd been popping. He didn't much care for that, but in the end, it wouldn't matter. She'd still fight. He could see it in her eyes. He knew which ones would fight. A fast hunt wasn't the same as a leisurely one, but there was pleasure in it just the same. A lot of pleasure. They were walking down the block, or rather, he was walking. She was stumbling while he held her up. One of her hands kept sliding down to rub his cock through his jeans, and despite the need, he was a little disgusted with her. Beggars couldn't be choosers, though, and he knew Katya was ideal for his needs. Ideal. Abruptly, she giggled and grabbed his hand, jerking him into an alley. "Let's do it in here." "Wouldn't you rather get a hotel?" he asked. "No." She grabbed the hem of her short dress, pulling it up to show that she wore no panties. Faint light fell across her hips and thighs, revealing her waxed cunt. "I want to do it here." She licked her finger and touched herself. "If you're good, then I'll let you get me a hotel. Later." He lifted a brow and followed her deeper into the shadows. This could be a new challenge altogether. He had some of his tools secured inside the leather jacket he wore. It wasn't much, but it would suffice. It wasn't like they were in a quiet area of town. He'd heard sirens 3 different times in the past 10 minutes, all from different directions. Voices rising and falling, the occasional yell, the pump and blast of music coming from somewhere close. Very close. Another club, he assumed. Behind him, he heard footsteps, a shout. Automatically, he lowered his head, hunched his shoulders, hiding his height, his face as much as he could as he moved across the busted-up pavement, feeling the crunch of broken glass under his feet. She smiled at him and rubbed herself harder. "You want to fuck me in here?" she whispered, batting her lashes at him, giving him what she must assume was a seductive smile. He smiled back and slipped a hand into his pocket. He needed a rubber. And a gag. Yes. He leaned in, kissed her, taking pleasure in it, giving her pleasure in return, smiling inwardly as she stilled, then sighed and shuddered against him. She whimpered in pleasure, and that pleased him. All the while her hands ran all over him, and he let her do just that. When he pulled a rubber from his pocket, she grabbed it from him and put it on him, although he was careful to catch the wrapper, tucking it inside a zippered pocket, keeping it nice and safe. Couldn't leave any fingerprints lying around after all. After he dealt with the wrapper, he found a thin pair of gloves, balled them up in his fist so she wouldn't notice, wouldn't see. She curled her hand around him, started to stroke, but he stopped her by reaching down, cupping her. She wasn't wet enough, not yet. Oh, he couldn't have that. A bit of finessing, a bit of patience, and a few more kisses, and she was mewling into his mouth, shaking and rocking against him, desperate, all but begging. He made certain she came before he did anything else. That was one of his favorite parts. Now it was almost time for the next favorite. He pulled his gloves on, quickly, quietly, kissing her to keep her from paying attention, although she was so strung out.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?